Hello, this is Pastor Rick, and I want to welcome you to the Lectionary Plus Bible series in preparation for worship on February the 23rd. We're glad you can join us. We're going to go over the texts for this Sunday, so whether you're here at Emmanuel in Naples, Florida, or up north, or wherever you are in the country or the world, you can prepare for worship. And then we will add some sermon notes for those who will be with us live or live stream here at Emmanuel in Naples. Our three texts are Genesis 45, 3 to 11 and verse 15, 1 Corinthians 15, 35 to 38 and 42 to 50, and Luke chapter 6, 27 to 38. Now let's go over those texts. First of all, I can just say, because I'm the preacher this week, we're not going to focus in on 1 Corinthians 15. Once again, Paul is talking there about the resurrected body of Jesus, how important it is. It's a wonderful text. Go and read it, because he builds the life of the disciple off of the resurrected Jesus, saying we will be like him. But we're not going to look at 1 Corinthians 15. We're going to start with Genesis 45. This is the story of Joseph, one of the great stories in Genesis. You remember that Joseph, Abraham's 12th son, the youngest, had his coat of many colors. His brothers were jealous. They beat him up, threw him in a well, sold him into slavery. But it all turns around. And the story we're reading here Sunday is the story of his brothers coming because of a famine. They're coming to Egypt where there's still some grain and some food. And they run into Joseph, who's now the second in command and in charge of all the food. They don't recognize their brother. Of course, they weren't even expecting to see him, but he recognizes them, and there's a lot of plot twists that happen here. But finally, after he has determined that the family is struggling, his one other favorite brother is still alive, and that they're desperate, he tests them. But he finally says, I have to tell you the truth, guys. I'm your brother. And you can imagine the horror, the surprise, but the horror that now one of the most influential and powerful people in the world in Egypt, the person they're most dependent on because they're hungry and they're struggling, and so is their family back in Canaan, is the brother they sold into slavery. Yikes. And so here we're going to follow this story about Joseph opening up the future for the whole family and for himself, really, and that he forgives his brothers. And he says, you meant it for evil, I know that, but God meant it for good. He saw God active, saving the world actually through him, through his management skills, but now also saving his family. Great story about forgiveness, which ties also into our third text, Luke chapter 6. Again, we're in the Sermon of the Plain. And I want to say that if you will go to the Sunday Forum this week, we're going to compare the Sermon of the Mount and the Sermon of the Plain. One sermon, but told differently. Sermon of the Plain is trying to set up a different ethic of how we live as disciples of Jesus. Not just do unto others as you would have them do to you. So if someone invites you out to dinner, then you invite them out to dinner. If someone sends you a Christmas card, you send them a Christmas card. No, can you act graciously even to those who don't deserve it, who cannot give back, who cannot return your generosity? And so here Jesus in this sermon says, don't judge, be good, actually lend to people. Even those who steal from you, just let them have it. I mean, there's this overabundance of generosity. If someone strikes you, Jesus says, what do? You turn the other cheek. If someone steals your shirt, you offer them your coat as well. And then he kind of ends it up with, forgive and be generous. Forgive and be generous. And it says, if you do that, it will be given to you back a good measure, pressed down, shaken together, running over. That's the type of blessings Luke says that the Lord will place in your lap. This sermon has changed people for generations. And so I want to invite you, in preparing for the worship, to read the Sermon of the Plain, Luke chapter 6. It's not even a whole chapter. And I promise you, you will be touched as well. So now let's turn to the preacher for the Sunday, which happens to me, as we go over some of the points that just might pop up in the sermon. So let me now give a couple points about the sermon. First of all, we will talk, as I mentioned, as I will talk about in detail in the Sunday Forum, we're going to compare the Sermon of the Mount and the Sermon of the Plain. Very important message. And I will go into detail of some people in history who their lives were transformed. They were converted to Christ through these sermons. That's how powerful they are. And so I first want to encourage every time that we talk about the Sermon of the Plain that you go and read it. It's a sermon, and often we pick it apart and look at just small pieces like, judge not, and you will not be judged, right? Don't worry, be generous, love your enemies. Those are all important aspects of this sermon. But it's interesting that this text ends by comparing the life of discipleship to building your house on a good foundation. It's very interesting. Here, one of the Sermon on the Mount says, don't build it on the sand. Luke says, build it on a good foundation. The whole idea is this new ethic that Jesus is promoting. Well, it's good for your life. In fact, building up a solid home, building up your heart, as the sermon says, is what Jesus' real intention is. These aren't just good suggestions on how to live. He says this is how you build a life of discipleship, which will then turn around and be a blessing to you. So we're going to have fun with this sermon. I say fun because this is one of the most challenging sermons in the Bible, the Sermon on the Plain. Read it over. We'll let God speak to you this week, even before you get to worship. Thanks for joining us for this Lectionary Plus. Bye-bye now.